You can fit in the middle there.
Gracie.
Gracie.
Oh, Gracie, don't be extra. Good morning.
It's so sunny. And I'm looking for my good side. Tell us something.
Tracy.
Oh, what's this one?
Your face is your good side.
Oh, wow. I just stick on somewhere. Look at this. That is so dangerous. I'm like, yeah.
Who is with us this morning?
Gaga.
Gaga's
Gaga.
there.
Gaga.
I'm the first one.
I'm gonna try to be a normal person for the whole thing.
Morning if you're joining us.
What is that?
Welcome. Luke's. Gagi. Beautiful Sunday morning.
Good morning,
Good
Isabel.
morning, Isabel. Mr. Seaman.
Opa.
It's confusing. I see Leonard Seaman, but I see my mom's face. So
He's got her as a
profile.
profile.
Lucas.
This is Daniel.
So hope you're well, Lucas.
Hello, everybody. I'm Daniel. Breeze,
Right. We didn't have broadcast last week, but we're back this week.
Is there rain?
Holidays are finished.
We ran at 10K.
Schools are starting this week, so it's going to start getting busy again. But yeah, welcome. I hope you had a good week and that you put aside some time this morning or whenever you're watching just to relax a little bit and also just to reflect a little bit this morning on some important stuff. So welcome if you're joining us for the first time or whether you are a regular. We hope you find today beneficial. Awesome.
What's official?
Beneficial.
Beneficial. Beneficial.
Beneficial.
Kids are ready for school. Look how excited they are.
So excited.
We're also extremely excited.
There's a long shiny green.
Yeah, it's mini.
Morning, Jean. Hope you're well.
Can we go now?
Yeah.
Yes, baby.
Yay! Let's go!
Take your chips and vibe.
Please take the dogs then. Righty.
Good morning, Jean.
The last time we saw you, we finished off with the book of Mark, and so today, I wouldn't say we're starting the book of Romans, but I would like to start in the first chapter of the book of Romans today, written by Paul around the middle of the first century. So we're going to be tackling a little bit of an interesting subject. The heading for today is Upside Down God, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. But yeah, all right. Great, so we can get going. We're gonna hit Romans, and we're gonna hit it Romans 1:16 to 25 today, and so this looks like Paul's critique of the way that religion developed. Remember, he's speaking to the Romans, so he's speaking into the Roman polytheistic empire, the way that they think about the gods and how they got to some of those conclusions. And he's bringing that into the light of what happened with Jesus and the cross. And of course, in Roman religion, you know, the gods are always victorious and they're great and they're majestic. But Paul's God died on a cross. And so this is why he starts by saying, when he writes to the Romans, I'm not ashamed of the good news. And you only say, I'm not ashamed, when you think there might be reason to be ashamed, or maybe you believe that in the minds of others there should be reason. And so that's how he starts. He says, I'm not ashamed of the good news. But before we get into the story, I just want to create a little bit of background with regards to the history of religion and its natural development. So this is a subject, I think, which anyone who is interested in religion or in God, the understanding of God, which I assume you might be watching this broadcast, I think it's something that it is worthwhile investing in, reading something on what evidence we have for where religion started, how they started. I would recommend a book by Richard Holloway. It's one in a long or a subset of a big series called A Little History of Religion, and it can be found on Kindle. It's quite cheap. a nice read to give you a broad understanding of kind of where religions came from. A lot of people think that religion started with the Bible, but it just doesn't work like that. So, what do we know? Well, as far as I know, and I say that with great reservation because I'm not an expert in this field, but it seems to us like the idea of religion starts, the earliest signs of religion, Tori, in humans is the fact that we bury our dead. Now we know the difference between us humans and the animal kingdom is just simply our ability to think beyond. We think beyond. I don't know if you've ever tried not thinking. Sometimes when I can't fall asleep, I try to lay down and not think, but it's just an absolute
The more you try to not
impulsive
think, the more you think.
thing. It is, you think. And we think about things. We look at trees and we are in awe and in wonder looking at this beautiful tree. And then we think, where did it come from? How did it get here? How does it work? In a pre-scientific era, everything was just an absolute amazement. And it is, as far as I understand, the ancients never thought of anything as supernatural because everything was motivated by some supernatural force. So as far as we know, the earliest evidence of people getting buried is around 100,000 BC. That's a long time ago. Evidence of people burying their dead, possibly in the anticipation of some form of afterlife or some form of journey that the dead has to go through. And then around 10,000 BC, we find some of the first evidences of worship places of worship, where people actually conducted some form of worship or ritual. So this thing it's kind of part of who we are. It seems like it developed because we are looking at the world around us in wonder, and we want to know how, why, and I mean, those questions remain to be the most important questions in life: why and how. So it seems like the very first forms of religion was what is called animism, which is the idea that everything is animated by living souls and by living spirits. So in other words, the wind is actually, a soul is attributed to it. So an example of that today would possibly be the Aborigines from Australia, which believe that everything is divine around them and that gods kind of inhabit everything. The wind has a soul, the sea has a soul. Oh, my creepy has a soul. My creepy has a soul. And so it was just this general type of concept that everything was enlivened and godly and divine around them. And this seems to be the very earliest form of religion around the world, not only, of course, in Australia. And then what came next was shamanism. And shamanism was the idea that there were people amongst the people who kind of understood how things worked. You know, they figured out that if we dance in this way, the rain comes. You know, or if we bring these type of offerings or things, then this works. And those shamans were those who kind of had an inside knowledge on how things work, and people would come to them for advice, knowledge. Maybe the famous of all shamans of all time is Loveless from Happy Feet, who's this penguin, if you haven't seen the movie, who seems to be the wise one amongst them. Everybody will come, and he's quite obnoxious, and he gets upset if people don't like his answers, and he tells everyone that he has this necklace around his neck which he got on a spiritual journey to a forbidden shore, but it's obvious it's just the plastic remains of a six-pack, and he's revered and adored by everyone because of this plastic that's stuck around his neck. And he becomes shaman-like. He has insight into the spiritual world, and if people want answers, they come to him. And so this is a really, really ancient idea. I think sometimes I think some forms of the charismatic Christians haven't quite left the shamanistic idea. It's still very deeply embedded in us. And then out of that comes, I guess, type of forms of priesthood that develop, a class of priests. And then it seems like we as humans, I think the fancy word is we anthropomorphized the gods. In other words, we started giving human-like attributes to gods. Gods became families with heads. The dad, the king of the gods, or the god of gods, or the Most High, would be the god over all the gods. And they would have families, and they do horrible things. If you read some of the polytheistic epics and myths, they were just absolutely barbaric, really. And they kind of took on the nature of humans. But they were unseen, they can't be seen. And now when the wind moves, it's not the wind itself that is a god, but it's the god X that's moving the wind. And so the thing about polytheism and that era of religion is that the main feature for me is that we attributed human attributes to the divine. And so they became people, in a sense, divine people. Characters, yeah. With thoughts, with emotions, jealousy, hate, etc., etc. And so one of the things of polytheism is when there is a massive storm that arises and blows your house away, you don't know which god did it. And because while you're trying to offer a sacrifice to appease the one god, the other one gets upset. So there's no sense of justice really in such a type of system. It's just whichever, you just try and not offend any god. There's a lot to be said about that. And then we get out of that arising ideas of monotheism. In other words, the idea that there really is actually just one kind of a god that created everything. And some people believe that all the other gods became the sub-beings of the divine, for instance, like angels and demons, and so on. It morphed into that type of idea. This type of thing we see in ancient Persian, I think Zoroastrianism, even in the Egyptian, I think it was Atenaken that initialized some type of monotheism. But then, of course, most famously and kind of most enduring is the monotheism of the Abrahamic faiths like Christianity, Jewish faith, and also Islam. And so that's kind of like and this happens over really tens of thousands of years, probably much longer even, that we've kind of graduated, we're kind of evolving in a religious sense out from the idea that nature itself is God into this idea that I think most of us find ourselves today in the monotheistic faith. So there's one creator, there's possibly some other beings as well, and now you can only blame one, there's not many, there's only one. So if something happens, like, why is he doing this? And so it's a place that we find ourselves in. So Paul is addressing the Romans at this time. The book of Romans written to the Gentiles, specifically the Romans, which were quite Hellenized at this stage, Greek. And later on he takes on the Jews as well. But at this point, when we're going to be jumping in, I want you to at least think about the religious culture of the time. It's highly polytheistic. There's many gods. There's the great gods. There's the god of this, the god of that, the god of war, the god of love, etc., etc. They are very, very human-like. They get angry. They're jealous. They kill. They don't really have a sense of justice so much. Humans exist to serve the gods, and then in return, the gods will give them a good harvest or a baby boy or fertility for their animals. And it's in this environment that Paul comes. Now, before we jump into Paul, I just want to put a little side note out there. Paul seems to be a lot more humble about the scripture he wrote than what we are about the scripture he wrote. Paul states quite clearly that he uses the word we, but he includes himself, can only see in part. In other words, he's writing, and even if we do believe that it is inspired by the Spirit of God, we do understand that Paul did not understand everything. And so he writes from his context. So what's the context of this portion in Romans? Well, something new has happened in history. In the middle of this largely polytheistic world, with the exclusion possibly or the exception possibly of the Jewish faith, Jesus appears on the scene. They believe he's the Son of God, is divine in some sense, but he's not a conquering rider on a horse. He doesn't send winds to destroy people. He doesn't win. He loses. He dies, killed by the Roman soldiers on the cross. And I think this is why Paul starts by saying, look, I'm not ashamed of what I saw on the cross. And I think the reason he does that is because the cross is such an upside down idea of who God is supposed to be, at least to that time. Yes. Today, I think it's much more plausible to conceive of a God that can win by losing, that can win people by offering himself, that can bring people to him by being humble. But at that time, I think we need to realize that wasn't really a possibility.
Yeah.
It was very unknown. It was kind of, please understand what I'm saying, it was an embarrassment to some degree that your God would lose in such a way. Now, Paul believed Jesus was resurrected, but nobody else around them really believed that. The Romans surely didn't believe that. And so to the average Roman, Paul's God got killed by soldier Quercy down the road. That's it. And so Paul is here defending and saying, but wait a minute, guys. What I'm trying to explain to you looks different. Okay, so here we go. We're jumping now. That was very, very quick. But let's go to Romans 1, verse 16. Paul says here, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, right, of the Messiah. For it is the power of God unto salvation. Think of salvation here as deliverance, saving, healing, prospering. Right? It's not just, this is not about, let's see who can get into a smart place after they die. It's about delivering and protecting humankind. He says, this story, this event of God losing in this sense on the cross is actually the power of God. In other words, what he's trying to say to them is God doesn't work the way we thought. And although he's saying this to the Romans, I can assure you that this will also not sit very well with the Jewish monotheistic faith, who were expecting Messiah conquering, beating everyone, releasing. It didn't sit well. They still today, Jews don't accept Jesus because the suffering servant is outside the mindset of the warrior God that the Jews had in mind. But he says this is God's way of delivering not only the Jew but also the Greek. In other words, not only the Jewish but also the Gentiles, the rest of the world. And so Paul goes on deliberating or speaking about the Romans or the Gentiles, how they got to where they are. But then later on goes to the Jews and says, look, just because you have the law, it doesn't mean you understand what God is like. And I think that becomes clear as we contrast the Old and New Testament. So Paul then explains what is he saying when he says that God wants to deliver the world through this event or this cross or this good news. What is this good news? So he says in verse 70, he says, for in it is the righteousness of God revealed. Now, just a moment, because there's words here that the righteousness is a word that we're so familiar with that we know it no longer has any real punch when we speak about it as Christians. But righteousness here, the Greek word means the equity of God. Now, equity for us is also an accounting term, Tori. If you go down the financials of a business and you get to the balance sheet, there'll be a little thing there called the equity of the owners or the owner's equity. That's the net worth of the business or of the owner of the business. In other words, it's the weight of the owner. And so the equity has got to do with character, it's got to do with weight. In monetary terms, if you want to use an analogy, it means the economic wealth of the one that started this thing and sustains this thing and looks after this thing. So righteousness here is not so much about doing A, B, and C and not D, E, and F, but righteousness here is about who God is. And I like to use here to say God's equity. In other words, the value of God. And so he says, well, in this message of an upside down Jesus, a losing, dying successfully God, is actually the equity of God. Now that's revolutionary, and I think it has changed the world, and it continues to change the world. He says, in this is the equity of God revealed, right? From faith to faith, and it's about trust, right? As it is written, the just shall live by faith. So the little portion here, the just shall live by faith, actually comes from Habakkuk, and Paul is quoting the prophet Habakkuk. Lived in a time just before the Babylonian exile. Things weren't going the way he thought it should. The good people were dying, the bad people were prospering. And Habakkuk was crying out to God, please, can you fix the situation? Things are not the way they should be. And so God's answer to him was, the just, or those who are justified, are going to live by their trust in me. And so Paul brings this in here and says, it looks like Jesus and God's way is upside down, right? Yeah. To us who grew up in this world that looks like the way it looks at the moment. But this is God's way of setting things right, of bringing things His way around. We need to trust Him that this is the way in which He's going to do things. Okay, so then verse 18 goes on to say, he says, for the wrath of God. Now, in this portion, he's about to, in my view, it is kind of giving a critique of the history of religion. If from my point of view, if you look at it, he's explaining how from the very beginning we had something in us that tells us about God. We had nature and the world around us that is telling us about God, but we twisted it and we followed our own mind about this, and we ended up in the wrong spot. But now God is helping us to change direction and go in the right direction. In other words, when we stand and we look at the cross looks upside down to us, but the reality is we are upside down. And by God showing us the picture, He is helping us to turn our mind upside down. It's kind of like me showing you a picture of yourself, but the picture is upside down, and you say to me, but the picture is upside down, and then eventually you realize you're the one that's upside down. The picture is the right way up. And I think that's why Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the picture being upside down, because the reality is we are upside down. And by the upside down picture, God is turning us around. Okay, so for the wrath of God is revealed. Now, wrath simply means the ambitious desire of God, right? Is revealed from heaven. The word is not against all ungodliness, but the Greek word is epi, means over and above all ungodliness and unrighteousness. In other words, the cross does exactly this. It puts above all the systems of the world, the way in which those systems work. Above all of that, God's desire is placed, and it is a way of Him contrasting our ungodliness. Ungodliness here means the inability to adore what God has given us, or to adore God for who He is. Unrighteousness meaning no equity, or just not understanding God's equity, or possibly the injustice that sits around us. Let me read this again. It says, for the wrath of the desire of God is revealed from heaven over all the inability to adore and the injustice that man finds himself in at the moment. And then he says this of men, and I want you to just listen to this. Is tricky, but it's so powerful. He says, these men who ungodly, unrighteousness, unrighteous, who hold the truth in unrighteousness. So the word hold here is kata eko, which means to push down and hold, to hold back the truth through the injustice. And so Paul is saying, guys, we're actually holding back the truth by the way that we live and the way that we do things. What we'll see in a moment in the next verse, is Paul is not speaking of truth as something that comes from the outside so much. But Paul is actually speaking of truth as something that comes from the inside, but our thinking brains, our reasoning, our biological programming actually pushes down the truth of God within inside us until we start realizing we're upside down and we let that out. Now have a look at verse 19 and 20, because it does exactly that. Paul then says, he says, because that which may be known of God is manifest in or to them, for God showed it unto them. And so here, the them and the they here is not Christian, and it's not really exclusively Jewish, but he's really speaking about the Gentiles, and therefore really all of mankind. That God has already started showing Himself to all of us. Now, you don't need to be a Christian to start knowing about God, otherwise this portion would mean nothing. There's something that God has done that already, or kind of from the inside, or at least to us, He's starting to show Himself. So verse 20 says, for the things that aren't seen, or the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So basically in this portion, he's just saying, look, the unseen, which I'm assuming Paul, when he says unseen, he's really talking about God and everything that's spiritual, the way we would use the word spiritual. He says those things are unseen, but they can be known and seen by what is actually visible, touchable, and experientiable. So if you think about that in terms of the history of religion, this is exactly how religion developed. Religion developed because people woke up and saw this ball of fire in the sky. They didn't know what it was. They want to know, what is that and how is it? But our minds led us along a path that we ended up with the wrong thing, and we'll speak about what this wrong thing is in a moment. But it's as if the world around us is God's enticement for us to ask. I mean, what is it in us that makes us yearn and ask and want to know and want to understand? It's actually the world around us that does that for us. And I actually, personally, I think God is okay with that. That was kind of part of the process. That first we need to ask, and then He brings the answer. I don't know if you've ever tried to teach your son something he's not wanting to learn, or give him the answer to a question he didn't ask. It's an absolute impossible task. But when there is a genuine interest, show of interest in the question, that seeking is present, then it is easy to start opening up. And I think that's what nature and God does for us. And I even want to bring that to today. That's what science does for us. The study of nature, natural science, does exactly that for us. Who is this being that put this thing together in this way? And you know, for a very long time, our view of nature and of science was very structured, Newtonian, I think is the term. Everything worked exactly like this, like this. But since we've discovered quantum physics, quantum mechanics, things have changed. Things are stranger. The world and the world around us is so much stranger than what we thought. But what we should acknowledge is what it's telling us is God is so much stranger than what we thought. And we are busy awakening out of the ideas we've made in our own mind to the reality of what it is and how it is that we are in. And that's kind of what Paul is saying. He says, look, nobody has an excuse, because everyone wants to know where they come from because of the wonder of the world that speaks to us of that which is the unseen. Okay, so in a way, he's describing the development of religion here. He's saying animism, which is this very early idea of looking at the amazing nature and attributing divinity to every aspect and force of nature, is kind of how God gets us to think and how He leads us on the path towards who He is, right? And then later on he says, in verse 20, he says, we then start understanding. We start getting understanding of what's going on around us and how to feed into it and how to live off it and how to interact with nature and so on. But then things go wrong for us as humans, and that's the portion we want to end off with today. Things go wrong for us because our enticement doesn't always lead us in the right direction. If you think of the Adam and Eve epic of Adam and Eve and the apple, it's the idea that humanity has a will, has a brain, is conscious in a way that animals are not, that leads us to do things which maybe sometimes we shouldn't be doing, and going off in directions that maybe we shouldn't. And it's almost always our ego, our selfishness, our self-preservation that leads us in those directions. And so this is exactly what happens here in this portion. So where does everything go wrong, or where did everything go wrong, at least from our perspective? Verse 21, because that when they knew God, they glorify Him not as God, neither were they thankful, but they became vain in their imagination, right? So the imagination, obviously we know today, is in the brain and not in the heart, which the ancients believed. But what Paul's basically saying is, he says that their vain imaginations and their foolish heart became darkened. And so in our search for the origin of this beautiful world that we've inherited, we let our imagination get ahead with ourselves. Now, if you bring that backstory to the short history of religion we spoke about earlier on, leads us from attributing divinity to a tree or a wind into a polytheistic idea of the gods are there, they're like a family, they're human family just like us, but they've got superpowers somewhere else. This is where our mind kind of leads us. But the hope is that whatever God does is that he would lead us back to the truth of what he is, and therefore what we are, and what our purpose is. So the problem is here, our imagination runs wild with us. If you're a human, you know this. Something happens during the day, at night you go lie in your bed and your brain starts ticking over the possibilities of this event, what it could mean, why it possibly has happened. What you go into the past, you go into the agony of the moment, you jump into the future. We have this ability. So we did the same thing with what the source of all this beauty, and the net result is, and Paul makes it quite clear, and for me it's quite interesting that Paul comes to this, which is the idea is not foreign to his time, because even some of the Greek philosophers came to this idea, that we ended up worshipping the creature instead of the creator. So what does that mean? Obviously in this portion here, Paul is mentioning, we turned God into birds and four-footed animals, and we made images, statues, I think would probably be what he would be referring to, of human-like statues of gods. There was no way for us to imagine God beyond attributing to him what we know, what we can see. And so it's almost a natural process that in the end, we would think of God as some human type of just superpower, all-knowing, all-powerful, omniscient type of being, but human. And what we do in that moment is, even us, and even the Jews who never grabbed onto the idea of statues, I think this goes way beyond the idea of having a statue of an animal or a cow, or even of God somewhere in your house. It goes also beyond not having a statue. But at the core of this issue is attributing human attributes to a God who is so clearly not human. Giving him our emotions, our ways of doing, beyond giving him our anatomy, which we've done. The scriptures does that all the time. It gives God hands and feet and ears and eyes and wool hair, and beyond that, because I think most of us have moved beyond that place where we're saying, God has two arms and legs and feet because we're made in his image. I think most of us has moved on from that. But the next step is to realize that God is not human-like, even in character or in his emotions. He does not necessarily have a mind or a heart in the same way that we have these things. And so let me read what Paul says here. He says, we changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, birds, beasts, and creeping things. So he mentions, some people worship birds, they worship, but also the worship of God as a man, which was what polytheism was really about. It was that the gods were like men with superpowers. And Paul is addressing that and saying, guys, maybe we've gone wrong. Now, I think it is Plato, who was a Greek philosopher of, I think, the 3rd century BC. It was either him or Socrates, or Plato recording Socrates saying that if the horses had gods and imaginations to think of their gods would be horses.
Yeah.
And what he was trying to say by that, because even the Greek philosophers started realizing that their gods were human-like. And this can't be. Why? This is an error in the system, that we project ourselves onto God. And I think this is kind of where Paul's going with this, at least when I read it today. He says in verse 24, he says, wherefore God also gave them up. In other words, Paul's understanding of this is, because these guys imagined the gods to be like humans, they followed their gods who are exactly like them. And so they end up in, and these are the words he says, uncleanness, lust of their hearts, dishonoring their bodies between themselves. So the reality is we become what we worship, in a sense. That's kind of like I guess to me it's like a truth, that whatever you admire, that's the direction you go into. Our problem is we created God in our image. We admire our own jealousy and our own selfishness, our own justice, our own righteousness, and we project all of that stuff onto God. And we demand that he be jealous over us. We demand that he would do justice for us in our way, the way we understand justice. And really what we do there is we end up worshipping or serving the creation and not the creator. And I think what Paul is saying is, I'm not ashamed of the upside down God, because he's actually trying to show us that he's not like us.
Isn't that the result that we get after the Old Testament? A picture of a God who the people in the Old Testament thought were like them.
Yeah, and I think that's
where it comes from.
I think it's a very valid point. It is it's a controversial point for Christians, because I think not many Christians look at the Old Testament in that way, but I think it's become abundantly clear to me, Tori, that even within the monotheistic Jewish faith, which was a revelation of God at that time, I believe that the Jews projected their needs, their own ideas onto who God was. And that's why we need to be thankful for Jesus, because he breaks that mold completely in showing, no, God is actually humble. He's not the warrior that the Jews were looking for. He is happy to serve and be least. He's not the king that wants the best chair in the meeting. And I think that's why Jesus is so important to us.
Yeah.
That's why we call ourselves followers of Jesus, because we see in him the breaking of that mold. He is an absolute upside down idea of what God should be. If you read the accounts of his life, he's not what God should have been. I always use the birth accounts of in a manger, on a donkey, not in a palace, not with Herod. It's upside down, but it's upside down for a reason, because he's trying to actually show us the
right way up
are upside down. But not only that, our idea of him, which we model ourselves to, is also upside down, because our idea of him is actually just a glorified idea of ourselves. We end up, if we follow our imagination, we end up worshipping ourselves. And we project that onto the Creator, the one who supplied us with what we have around us. So Paul goes on to say the following. We changed the truth of God into a lie. And so I like to look at this, and Paul is not, he doesn't say we, sorry, he says who. In other words, they, those who. And I think he includes humanity in this, who recognize the truth. And this is kind of like a universal truth. No, I won't say that, but a universal longing in ancient peoples is that there's something beyond, right? That, in a sense, to me is a truth. But changing that into your own image eventually, after thousands of years, that whoever is beyond there is like me and does things the way I would like it done, it's changing the truth of God into a lie. And then he says, and they worshipped and served the creation more than the Creator. Now the word more than here is para. And para is, in mathematics, is where we get the idea of parallel, or parachurch, or paradiddle in music. It means alongside, parallel. And so what this says kind of is like, we serve the creation parallel to the Creator. In other words, we put them alongside, we make a alongside image, God but human, and we put them together. So let me give you an example of this. We believe God is omniscient. We believe he is all-knowing. We believe he is all-powerful. We believe he is infinite. We believe he is unknowable, unsearchable. And at the same time, we believe he is jealous like us. He fights his enemies like us. Here's a hard one. He needs to be worshipped like we long to be worshipped. He is requiring praise so that he can put his you can say, look, I'm praised. He's requiring glory for himself. These are the things we have projected onto him, because that's how we think. That's how we think. That's what we want. If we were God, Tori, we want praise. We want worship. We want glory. We want victory. And then Jesus comes and he upside downs the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so what we've done is we've created an image of God, which is there's this spiritual, infinite side, which we kind of all recognize, but at the same time we have this parallel creation side. Creature side is the word that King James uses. And it's a kind of a dualism of who God is. We've fashioned him in our image, just added an unlimited superpower side to him. And now he's this combo being, but we've created God in our own image.
Yeah.
And so the cross is trying to show us, just at least in terms of character, God is not looking for the things we are looking for. Or let me put this more succinctly. God is not looking for the things that we are looking for in God, or that we believe God is looking for from us. That's a hard pill to swallow. But I think for me it's become quite clear that we have made God in our own image. And we part of a process. This is a process. The human journey is a process of getting closer to the truth of what God is, and kind of in a way awaking from the myth and awaking from the lie we have told ourselves about who he is. Right, so verse 25 ends like this. We changed the truth of God into a lie, and we worshipped and served the creation in parallel with the creation, with the Creator. And of the Creator, he says, the one who is most adorable forever. And then he ends off with the word amen, which means this is a trustworthy saying. So from the beginning, when Paul says, I'm not ashamed, to the end where he says what we have done to God is we've projected ourselves, we've projected creation onto him. Really what we're discovering in this portion is that God is upside down to us. And that's a sobering thought, but it's the beginning of realizing that actually we are the ones who are upside down. And we are the ones that need to change our mind about what he is like. And really in essence here, I don't think it makes any sense to talk about the biology or the form of God, but I think more weighty is the idea of character or nature, which is something we struggle with, and I think most Christians struggle with that. I think I've struggled with that all my life. But I am starting to realize that I think I might have an upside down picture of who he is and what he is like. And I think that we need to be at least humble enough to reevaluate how we think and what we think, and to acknowledge, maybe as Paul said, that we only see in part. I think to go around believing that you know God fully because you've read the scriptures might be a bit of a stretch of the imagination. And one thing that is good and one thing that is hopeful and brings hope to us is, even Paul picked up, he says there's something in us. What we have in us and what we have around us is enough to start the process of knowing who he is. This knowing here in God is manifest in them in verse 19. The word manifest here literally means to enlighten. In other words, to shine a light upon. It's like God is shining a light from within. And I don't know if you recall John, I wrote down here, John 1 verse 9 speaks of Jesus as the light that lights up every man that enters the world. This is before we developed the idea of salvation or Christian salvation. John, together with Paul, is saying that there is something innate in us, and God has given us what we have around us to look for him, and that we can start to get to know him. And I think we just have to embrace the idea that we're part of a process of this actually happening, and that we need to be humble about it, and that we need to be longing and poor of spirit, I guess would be the right word to use, to remain in a longing position, seeking, looking, reevaluating these things. Okay, so that's all for today. Not sure if what we'll carry on next week. We'll have a look. But upside down God is not upside down. We are, and that's the point of all of this. That we might have him wrong. That he might not be like us. He might not get angry when we get angry. He might not get jealous when we would get jealous. He might not love when we would love. He might not hate when we would hate, which to me seems very much the picture we have of God, the picture of God we grew up with.
Yeah.
He's just doing everything we would do, but with much more power. What if God is upside down? What if losing successfully is really his art in giving himself to humanity? What if he truly is humble at heart and not looking for glory and praise
Proud.
and honor and worship? What if he is serving us and blessing us? Upside down. Thank you for being with us
Something to
today.
think about.
Think about it. Have a good week. We'll see you next week.
See you next time.